He left her with nothing but insults, walking out the door for a real woman. Weeks later, that same man was in handcuffs on her front porch. Marissa hadn't chased him, hadn't begged. She'd quietly uncovered the truth he thought he'd buried. Fraud, stolen money, and a trail of lies all pointed back to him. But the real shock, he'd been using her as part of his schemes. This is the story of how a woman left behind became the key to his downfall. And the morning she opened her door, to find justice waiting. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning light came in thin and pale, filtering through the blinds and long, uneven stripes across the kitchen counter. The coffee machine still hummed faintly, the air scented with the rich, bitter aroma of a brew that had barely finished. Dripping, Marissa sat at the table, one hand curled around the ceramic mug she had pulled from the cupboard out of habit. The steam rose in delicate curls, and she stared at it as though focusing hard enough might keep the rest of the morning from happening. Daniel stood in the doorway, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his posture tense but practiced, like someone who had rehearsed this moment until the words were second nature. "You're not a real woman anymore," he said flatly, as though he were describing a fact as unremarkable as the weather. No rise in his voice, no hesitation. The sentence landed between them with a quiet, sharp finality. Her fingers tightened on the mug's handle. She didn't ask him to explain. She didn't ask what a real woman meant in his mind. Some part of her already knew that his definition had nothing to do with the years she had spent holding the house together, working late into the night, or carrying more than her share when his business stumbled. It wasn't about love or partnership. It was about whatever new thing he had found that made him feel alive. Again alive, in a way he now believed she couldn't. She thought he might waver, that he might at least glance at the framed photo on the counter from their 10th anniversary trip. Or the small potted plant she had bought last week, because he once said the kitchen felt too sterile without something green. But he didn't look at any of it. His eyes were already on the door. The duffel strap shifted against his shoulder, the fabric of his jacket whispering against itself. "I'll come back for the rest later," he said. And then he was gone out into the cool air of the morning without a backward glance. The front door closed with a muted thud, followed by the sound of his car starting in the driveway. Marissa sat very still. The coffee was still warm in her hand, the steam still curling upward as though nothing had happened. She took a sip out of sheer muscle memory, the bitter liquid catching at the back of her throat. The mug felt heavier than it should have. For a long time, she just listened to the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the absence of his footsteps overhead or in the hallway. On the counter, the second mug of coffee he had poured for himself still sat, untouched, the dark liquid reflecting the pale morning light. She stared at it until the surface stilled completely, the last ripples fading. She didn't cry, not then. Not while the air still carried the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the sharper tank of coffee. Instead, she reached for the handle of his mug, poured the contents into the sink, and rinsed it under the tap until the water ran clear. She set it upside down in the drying rack beside hers. The blinds rattled slightly in a breeze that slipped through the kitchen window. She could hear the sound of a neighbor's dog barking, distant and almost muffled. Somewhere in that ordinary suburban noise, her life had shifted into something else entirely. On the table, a folded newspaper lay open to the business section, a habit of his she had never shared. She turned it over, face down, the print smudging faintly against her fingertips. In the sudden stillness, she became aware of the steady beat of her own pulse, louder than the ticking clock. The coffee in her mug had cooled. She set it down carefully, her hand lingering on the rim for just a moment before she stood, moving slowly through the kitchen as though each step was being measured against the life she'd had only an hour ago. The duffel was gone. His shoes from the hallway mat were gone. The jacket he always left draped over the dining chair was gone. But his absence was not clean. It was jagged at the edges, leaving fragments of him embedded in the air. She knew she'd find more in the days ahead, in drawers, in the smell of laundry, in the way the house felt too open at night. She stood at the doorway for a moment, looking out at the driveway where his car had been. The empty space felt as heavy as the words he'd left behind. Then she closed the door, turned the lock, and went back inside, where the coffee machine had already shut itself off. The day had only just begun. but it already felt like something was ending. The light in the kitchen had changed since morning. Softening into the muted tones of late afternoon, it slanted in through the window over the sink, catching dust motes in midair and casting them into slow, drifting spirals. Marissa sat at the table without moving much, her fingers loosely interlaced, resting exactly where they had fallen when she first sat down hours ago. She hadn't bothered to clear the table after breakfast. The half-empty sugar bowl, the crumbs from her toast, and the coffee mug she'd abandoned all remained. Like pieces of a still life, she had no desire to rearrange. This table had been Daniel's favorite boast to visitors. "The center of our home," he would say with a broad, welcoming sweep of his hand, as though the words themselves made it true. They had chosen it together in a furniture shop years ago, solid oak, heavy enough that it took to delivery men. To get it into the house, he had insisted on the matching chairs, the kind that creaked softly when you leaned back too far. She could still hear the faint echo of his voice from those first years, animated and warm, telling friends to sit, eat, stay a while, now. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional settling creak of the house. Each one seemed amplified in the stillness, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence of his footsteps. His restless pacing when he was on the phone, the low rumble of his voice as he read the news aloud in the mornings. Her gaze lingered on the salt shaker. It was a small, unremarkable thing, but she remembered the exact day they'd bought it. An impulse purchase at the grocery store because he'd said their old one looked tired. It was strange how objects kept their stories long after. The people in them had gone. The silence pressed in around her, not hollow, but weighted, as though it carried the echo of every conversation they had ever had in this room. Arguments about money whispered in the walls. Quiet apologies clung to the corners. Moments of laughter, sharp and sudden, seemed trapped in the grain of the wood beneath her palms. She could almost believe that, if she stayed still long enough, she might hear those moments again, thin, distorted, like voices on an old tape. She studied the faint scratches on the tabletop where Daniel had once set down his keys to hard after. A bad day. In the years since, she'd rubbed those marks with oil countless times, but they never faded. She used to think they gave the table character a lived-in quality. Now, they felt like scars, permanent, unavoidable. Through the window, she could see the neighbor's yard, where the wind nudged the branches of a maple tree just enough to send a scattering of leaves skittering across the grass. It was the sort of sight she would once have called to Daniel to see. Now, she kept it to herself, as if voicing it out loud might draw attention to the fact that there was no one left to answer. Her hands shifted slightly on the table, fingertips brushing the wood in a slow, absent gesture. She thought about moving, about standing up and putting the dishes in the sink, about finding something, anything to fill the hours until evening. But the thought alone felt exhausting, like lifting something far heavier than she could manage. She noticed the way that light touched the far edge of the table now, stretching shadows from the chairs across the floor in long, uneven lines. The shadows made the room feel smaller, closing in just enough to remind her that even without him here, his absence occupied space. She could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to breathe differently, slower, heavier than she had imagined. Before that, life without him might mean freedom, a kind of release from the constant push and pull of his moods. But freedom didn't sound like this. Freedom didn't sit at a table and listen to a refrigerator hum. Freedom didn't measure time by the shifting shape of sunlight on the floor. Somewhere outside, a car door closed and she lifted her head instinctively, her heart giving a small, involuntary jump. But the sound faded quickly, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Not him, not coming back. Just the world carrying on. Indifferent to the hollowed-out space in her kitchen, she let her gaze drop back to her hands, still resting in the same position. The weight in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it had settled deeper into the room, like dust after a collapse. The table was still the center of the home, but the home itself had shifted. Its center no longer held what it once did. It was only wood, now sturdy, unchanging, and utterly silent. It started with glances. The kind people exchanged in grocery store aisles when they'd already heard the story but wanted to see if you matched the picture. They'd been given. Marissa noticed them in the bakery section in the post office. Line at the gas pump. Faces she'd known for years, neighbors' parents from the school board. The woman who cut her hair would greet her politely, but linger just a second too long, eyes soft with curiosity or edged with something closer. To pity, she didn't have to ask what they'd heard. In a town this size, news traveled faster than weather, carried on the voices of people who considered it a civic duty to keep up with each other's lives. The details arrived in pieces, like shards of glass catching light at different angles. First, someone mentioned Daniel was doing well for himself in a tone that implied more than it said. Then, a friend of a friend let it slip that he had been seen at the Junction Diner, his arm draped over the back of a booth that wasn't his to claim anymore. The woman across from him was younger, much younger, and had a laugh loud enough to carry across the room. Her name surfaced a few days later over the produce section at Keller's Market. Talia, glossy black hair, skin like she'd never known a winter here, the kind of beauty that seemed designed to be noticed. Marissa nodded, as if the name meant nothing, as if her stomach hadn't already tightened in quiet recognition of a type. She'd seen before the rest came in whispers and lowered voices at the checkout line. Talia had worked at the wine bar. On Main until last month, she had been engaged once to a man who moved to Ohio after she called it off. Suddenly, before that, she'd been seen on the arm of a contractor who ended up divorcing his wife within the year. The pattern was so neatly drawn, it almost felt scripted. The sort of small-town cautionary tale people enjoyed passing around because it was easier than looking too closely at their own lives. Marissa didn't ask for more. The words found her. Anyway, delivered by people who believed they were helping or who simply couldn't resist the pull of a well-shaped rumor. She learned that Talia had moved Daniel into her apartment above the old hardware store, that they were seen together, often late-night drives, lingering in shop doorways, laughing at something only they shared. The image formed in her mind without her permission, Daniel leaning in, that familiar half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the one that used to be reserved for her. Talia tilting her head just so, her hair catching the light, laughing in a way that made other people look up. It was the kind of scene she might have found beautiful once, before she learned how quickly beauty could be weaponized at night. Lying in bed with the hum of the street lamp outside, Marissa thought about the phrase he had used. A real woman. She wondered what that meant now. Was it youth? Hair that shone like magazine covers? Laughter that could drown out the sound of bills piling up or business deals going wrong? She tried to remember if she had ever been that kind of woman for him, or if the definition had shifted over the years without her noticing. In quieter moments, she recognized the truth she didn't want to admit. It wasn't just Talia. It was what Talia represented. A chance for Daniel to start over without the weight of a shared history, without someone who knew where all the cracks were. Marissa carried 12 years of memories with him, good, bad, and everything between. Talia carried none. That kind of clean slate was intoxicating to men like Daniel, who preferred the chase to the keeping. Once, over coffee at the kitchen table, her neighbor Anne leaned forward with that half-apologetic look people get when they're about to say something they know will sting. "Don't take it personally," she said, Talia's. Well, she's done this before. As if that should make the betrayal easier, as if being part of a pattern was somehow less cutting than being the exception. Marissa nodded, thanked her for the coffee, and changed the subject. But the name lingered in her mind long after, Talia. It rolled off the tongue easily, like a song lyric you couldn't shake. She wondered if Daniel said it differently than he'd said her own name, softer or quicker, saving a certain tone just for her. She didn't know yet that the shine would wear off, that glossy hair lost its luster in certain lights, that loud laughter could sound hollow in the wrong room. For now, she only knew that the town had decided on its version of the story, and in that version, Talia was the prize. Marissa was the chapter before, the one people skimmed to get to the part where the drama began. She sat alone at her kitchen table that evening, her hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, and thought about the distance between what people believed and what they would never see. Somewhere across town, Daniel was laughing in a way he hadn't laughed with her in years, and she was sitting in the same chair he once called the center of their home, listening to the kind of silence that didn't care about truth at all. The house was still. The kind of stillness that comes after too many days without someone crossing the threshold. Marissa stood in the bedroom doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. The late afternoon light slanted across the unmade bed, catching on the edges of the dresser where dust had begun to settle. She hadn't touched most of his things since the morning he left. It had been easier to let them sit there, as if the room might stay suspended in that moment. Proof that what happened wasn't permanent, but now the sight of them felt different, less like a pause, more like something unfinished. The open space on the floor where his duffel had been, the tie draped over the back of a chair, the shoes lying neatly under the window as though he might slip into them at any moment. They were artifacts of a life that no longer belonged to her, and she found herself wanting them gone. She took the largest box from the stack by the hall closet and set it on the bed. The cardboard gave a low, hollow sound under her hands. The first shirt she picked up still smelled faintly of his. Cologne sharp, clean, and out of place in a room that had settled into a different rhythm without him. She folded it carefully at first, a habit she couldn't break, before placing it in the box. One by one, she added more pressed shirts from the closet. T-shirts with faded prints from vacations years ago, sweaters with elbows worn thin. The second box filled quickly with shoes, polished leather loafers, scuffed running sneakers, the heavy boots he used in winter. Each pair landed with a muted thud, the sound carrying a strange finality. She didn't linger over them. These were not keepsakes. They were evidence, proof that he had lived here. That there had been a we once, however fractured it had become. On the dresser, the small change tray still held loose coins, cufflinks, and a folded receipt from a dinner she hadn't been invited to. The date on the paper made her pause. It was from a week before he left. She smoothed it flat with her fingers, staring at the unfamiliar restaurant name and the total amount beneath it. A dinner for two, wine included. She placed it in a smaller box she had brought for papers and miscellaneous things. From the nightstand drawer came more hotel key cards, business cards with numbers scribbled on the back, a pen she recognized as hers, its cap chewed in the way he did absent-mindedly when thinking. She placed everything inside the box without comment, letting the items speak for themselves in their quiet, damning way. The hardest was the photo frame on top of the bookshelf. It held a picture from their early years a winter trip, snow in the background, both of them leaning into each other as though the world beyond the frame didn't exist. Her fingers lingered on the glass, tracing the outline of their smiles. For a moment, she considered keeping it, hiding it away somewhere he'd never see. But the thought of it tucked in a drawer, waiting to be stumbled across years later, felt heavier than letting it go now. She placed it face down in the box and didn't look at it again by the time she had finished. The bedroom felt lighter, though not emptier. The absence of his things made space she hadn't realized she needed, even if the air still carried his shadow. She taped the boxes shut and slid them along the hallway until they sat by the front door in a neat, staying silent row, standing there. She looked at them the way one might look at suitcases before a trip full of the familiar but destined for somewhere else. These weren't just clothes and shoes and scraps of paper. They were the residue of 12 years, condensed into cardboard. Waiting to be carried out of her life, she stepped back, the faint scrape of the boxes on the hardwood still in her ears, and turned off the hall light. In the dimness, they looked smaller, almost manageable. Tomorrow, she told herself, they'd be gone. Tonight, they would wait by the door, silent witnesses to the fact that he had been heroned, that now he wasn't. The desk sat in the corner of the small study, a heavy walnut piece Daniel had insisted on buying years ago because a real home needs a real desk. It had been his territory more than hers, its drawers filled with neatly stacked papers, pens that always worked, and the faint scent of the cedar oil he used to wipe it down every few months. Marissa hadn't touched it since he left. It had felt like crossing into someone else's space, even though the Lees and the Bills had both their names on them. But that afternoon, with the boxes of his clothes lined up by the door, she decided it was time. She started with the surface, clearing away the dust-coated lamp and the ceramic mug that had been holding an uneven collection of pens and paper clips. Beneath the lamp, there was a faint ring in the wood, a permanent mark from the years he ignored coasters no matter how often she asked. The first drawer opened with a slight stick, revealing stacks of receipts bound with rubber bands, some of them yellowing at the edges. They were ordinary things, grocery runs, hardware store purchases, oil changes. She set them aside in a pile, thinking she'd sort through them later, in case there was anything she needed to keep for taxes. It was in the second drawer, under a neatly folded sheaf of printer paper that she saw at a plain white envelope with the bank's logo in the upper left corner. Her name was printed alongside his, their shared address typed neatly underneath. The seal was still intact. She stared at it for a moment, her thumb brushing the edge. They had gone paperless years ago at his suggestion, but every now and then, a statement still arrived by mail, usually for accounts he managed. He always opened them first. Glancing at the numbers and tucking them away without comment, she slid her finger under the flap, feeling the resistance of the glue give way. Inside was a single sheet, folded in thirds. The paper felt heavy in her hands, the ink crisp. Her eyes went first to the balance. It took her a second to process the number, lower, far lower than it should have been. The amount sat there in black print, undeniable, a sharp drop from what she remembered seeing the last time she'd checked. She scanned the transaction history, her pulse picking up withdrawals in amounts just small enough to avoid triggering bank alerts. Transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. Purchases in cities he had no reason to be meaningless. They were the same cities he'd been visiting in those last months under the guise of business trips. The numbers blurred for a moment as her mind tried to reconcile them with the life they'd been living. They hadn't been wealthy, but they'd been comfortable. The account had always been their safety net, the place they pulled from for car repairs or holiday trips. Now, it barely held enough to cover the mortgage for a month. She sat back in the chair, the paper still in her hands. The room felt smaller, as though the walls had shifted inward. Her first instinct was to think of a mistake, a clerical error, a misprint. But the pattern in the withdrawals was too deliberate, too careful. Setting the statement on the desk, she opened the remaining drawers, pulling out folders and flipping through their contents. Old tax returns, insurance documents, a passport renewal form he hadn't filed, but no explanation for the missing money. No receipts to match the transfers, just silence where the answers should have been. Her eyes kept returning to the envelope. Now lying open beside the lamp, it wasn't just about the money, it was about the fact that he'd kept this from her. That while she was buying groceries, paying bills, and making sure the lights stayed on, he had been quietly draining the account they had built together. The late afternoon light had shifted again, throwing long shadows across the desk. She folded the statement back into the envelope and placed it on top of the other paper she'd gathered, separate from the rest. Some things didn't belong in storage boxes by the door. Some things needed to be kept close, if only as a reminder of what she hadn't seen before. She closed the drawers one by one, the sound of each click echoing in the quiet room. When she finally stepped away, the envelope was still there, its clean white surface catching the last bit of sunlight as if it had something left to say. The call came mid-morning, when the house was caught between the quiet of early hours and the restless hum of the day beginning. Marissa was in the kitchen rinsing a plate when the phone rang, the sound sharp against the stillness. She dried her hands quickly and answered without checking the number, expecting it to be Anne from next door or her sister calling to just check in, the way people did when they didn't know what else to say. "May I speak with Mr. Daniel Kerrigan?" The voice was brisk, professional, the kind that had delivered this request hundreds of times before. "This is his wife," she said automatically, the words slipping out before she could correct it. Wife. The title felt strange now, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Mrs. Kerrigan. "This is Jason from Alliance Recovery Services," the voice continued, polite but clipped. "I'm calling regarding a matter of some urgency. We have an outstanding balance on several business loans in Mr. Kerrigan's name," and Marissa's hand tightened on the phone. "Business loans." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, a reflex born of confusion rather than curiosity. "Yes," the man said, clearly prepared to explain in detail. "Multiple accounts currently in arrears. We've attempted to reach Mr. Kerrigan directly, without success. As his spouse, you may be able to," she cut him off. "I'm not responsible for his business affairs." Her voice was sharper than she intended, the edge carrying more truth than the man on the other end could possibly understand. "I understand I am, but as a cohabitating spouse, there may be shared liability depending on how the loans were." She didn't want to hear the rest. She didn't want to know the amount, the dates, the names of the lenders. She didn't want this stranger's voice bringing her into the folds of whatever mess Daniel had been weaving long before he walked out the door. Her thumb hovered over the button, but something made her hesitate, holding the silence between them for just a beat longer. "What's the balance?" she asked finally, her tone flat. There was a faint rustle of paper, the clicking of a keyboard. "At present, the combined total is..." She didn't let him finish. The number was already heavy in her mind without hearing it spoken. She pressed the button and ended the call. The kitchen felt different afterward. The sound of the refrigerator too loud, the ticking of the clock on the wall too deliberate. She set the phone down on the counter and leaned against the edge of the sink. Her palms braced against the cool porcelain. Outside, a pair of sparrows darted between the hedges, the flash of their wings quick and precise. She watched them until they disappeared, the movement leaving behind an emptiness that felt oddly familiar. The words business loans replayed. In her head, sticking to the corners of her thoughts, Daniel had always been vague about money, his explanations full of optimism and half-finished plans. She'd asked questions over the years how much was left to pay when the next installment was due, but his answers had been breezy, designed to close the conversation before it started. Now, with the weight of an unfamiliar debt pressing against her, she realized those moments had been more than casual dismissals. They had been deflections. She picked up the phone again, staring at the dark screen. She could call back. She could demand the details, the documents, the dates. But doing so would be like opening a door she couldn't close, inviting the weight of his choices to land squarely in her lap. She set the phone back down. The mug of tea she'd made earlier sat on the counter, untouched. She carried it to the table and sat in the same chair she always did, the one that still faced the empty seat he'd favored. The steam had long since faded, leaving the surface flat and still. She wrapped her hands around it anyway, letting the cool ceramic ground her in her mind. She pictured Daniel's face if she told him about the call. The faint crease between his brows, the way his mouth would twist just enough to suggest annoyance without tipping into outright anger. Tell her it wasn't her concern that he was handling it, and maybe he believed that. Or maybe he'd been telling himself the same thing for so long that it had become easier than admitting the truth. The phone stayed silent for the rest of the morning, but the call lingered like a shadow in the corners of the room. By afternoon, she had tucked it away alongside the unopened envelopes and the two careful explanations that had marked the last few years of their marriage. She didn't know if the debt was his alone, or if by some signature or clause buried in fine print, it had been quietly tethered to her as well. For now, she chose not to know. The not knowing was heavy, but it was still lighter than the weight of certainty. The grocery store was half empty, the kind of quiet that came in the early afternoon when the lunch rush had passed and the after-work crowd was still hours away. Marissa moved slowly through the produce section, her list folded in her pocket, but mostly ignored. She was picking by instinct apples that didn't bruise under her thumb. Lettuce with leaves, still crisp, a bundle of carrots that looked fresh enough to last a few days. She was trying to focus on the small rituals of choosing food, the kind of errands that grounded her in something ordinary. She was reaching for a carton of strawberries when she heard her name, Marissa. The voice was familiar, though she'd hoped not to hear it today, or any day for that matter. She turned to see Claire, Daniel's sister, standing a few feet away, a basket hooked over one arm. Claire's hair was pinned up neatly, her coat draped in that casual but deliberate way that made her look like she'd just stepped out of a catalog. It had been months since they'd spoken. Not since the week Daniel left. Back then, Claire's texts had been clipped and pointed, as though she'd already chosen a side and was too polite to pretend otherwise. "Claire," Marissa said evenly, her voice giving nothing away. They stood there for a beat, two women, in the middle of the grocery store, the air between them heavy with the shared knowledge of what had happened. Claire glanced at the strawberries in Marissa's hand, then back up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hear Daniel's doing well," she said. It was the kind of comment designed to sound harmless, but her tone carried a current. That was impossible to miss. Marissa set the strawberries gently in her cart. "That so?" Claire's smile sharpened just enough to show its edges. "Yes, and, well, at least now he's with a real woman." The words hung in the air, deliberate and heavy. It was the same phrase Daniel had used the day he walked out. Only now it was delivered with the kind of smirk that suggested Claire knew exactly what she was doing. Marissa didn't flinch. She didn't give Claire the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply looked at her, meeting her gaze long enough for the silence to become its own kind of answer. Claire shifted slightly, perhaps expecting a retort, perhaps realizing she wasn't going to get one. She adjusted her basket on her arm, the faint rattle of a box of pasta inside, breaking the moment. "I'm sure you'll land on your feet," Claire added, as if tossing a crumb of civility to soften the sting. Marissa gave the smallest of nods and turned her attention back. To the display of fruit, selecting another carton and checking for bruises, she could feel Claire still watching her, waiting for something, anger, hurt, a defense of her own worth, but Marissa had no intention of giving her that dot after a moment. Claire made a faint sound of dismissal, something between a sigh and a hum, and moved on toward the bakery. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor faded until it was gone entirely. Marissa exhaled slowly, though she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Her hands were steady as she placed the strawberries into her cart, but her mind was still caught on the phrase, on the way it had been delivered. She could almost hear Daniel's voice in it, see the faint curl of his lip when he said it too. That morning, she pushed her cart forward, moving on to the next aisle. Around her, the store resumed its quiet rhythm, someone debating over cereal, the soft whir of a refrigeration unit, the low hum of distant music. She let those sounds fill the space that Claire's words had tried to claim. By the time she reached the checkout, she had smoothed her expression into something neutral. She greeted the cashier, paid for her groceries, and carried the bags out into the bright afternoon. The air was cool and clean, the kind of air that could strip away lingering echoes if you let it. As she walked to her car, she realized she didn't feel the sharp sting she might have expected. Instead, there was a kind of steady, quiet refusal. Settling in her, Claire could believe whatever she wanted. So could Daniel. Their version of the story didn't have to be hers. She set the bags in the back seat, closed the door, and started the engine. The store receded in the rearview mirror, and with it, the smirk and the words that no longer had the power to touch her. The study was dim, even in the middle of the day, the single window half covered by a set of blinds that Daniel had never bothered to replace. Dust clung to the slats, softening the light into thin, pale strips that fell across the desk. Marissa stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the quiet. It wasn't a room she had entered often when Daniel lived here. He had treated it as his own space, the door sometimes shut, the drawers always closed. Now, with the house empty but for her, there was no one to keep her out. She stepped inside, the carpet muffling her footsteps, and ran her hand along the desk's smooth walnut surface. She'd already cleared the top days ago, boxing up stray papers and knickknacks. Only the drawers remained, a few of which had yielded nothing but pens, old receipts, and paper clips. But the bottom right drawer was different. She had tried it once before, half out of curiosity, only to find it locked. Daniel had kept the key somewhere. She had seen it once, a small brass thing on his keyring butt she'd never been given. He had laughed when she asked what was inside. "Just boring paperwork," he'd said, the kind of casual dismissal that was meant to end the conversation. She knelt now, studying the lock. It was small and worn, the metal darkened with years of use. She pulled open the top drawer and rummaged until she found a thin, flathead screwdriver. The lock was old enough that it didn't take much, just a few careful turns. A soft click, and the drawer slid open with a reluctant groan. The smell hit her first, paper and something faintly metallic, like coins kept too long in a drawer. Inside, the files were arranged neatly, each in a manila folder with Daniel's handwriting on the tabs. She took the top one out and flipped it open. Business contracts. She scanned the first few pages, her eyes catching on names she didn't recognize, companies she'd never heard of. Some were signed in Daniel's bold script, others bore only his initials. The next folder was thicker, the edges of the papers inside worn and softened. Bank statements, different accounts from the ones they shared. She traced the columns of numbers, noticing patterns, deposits that came in from unfamiliar sources, withdrawals in odd amounts that didn't match any bill or expense she knew about. The dates were scattered across months, even years. Beneath those, another set of documents, this time stamped with red ink. Final notice, past due, legal action pending. She sat back slightly, the papers trembling faintly in her hands. Most were addressed to Daniel's business, but a few had their home address printed in bold across the top. Her eyes caught on the amounts thousands owed, deadlines long past. The quiet of the study seemed heavier now, the air thick with the weight of what she was holding. She set the notices down in a neat stack on the desk, forcing her hands to steady dot at the back of the drawer. She found a smaller envelope, unmarked. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. She opened it to find a handwritten list of dates, amounts. Some of the amounts were large, circled in red ink. She didn't recognize any of the names, but the repetition of certain ones told her they mattered. She sat there for a long time. The open drawer at her side, the desk now cluttered. With the contents Daniel had kept locked away, each piece felt like a fragment of something larger, something deliberate. Whatever his boring paperwork had been, it was layered with debts, quiet transactions, and obligations he had never spoken of. When she finally began returning the papers to their folders, she didn't lock the drawer again. Instead, she left it slightly open, as if acknowledging that the secrecy around it was gone. The knowledge of what lay inside couldn't be tucked away as neatly as the papers themselves. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her shirt, and looked at the desk one last time before leaving the room. The study felt different now, his. Space anymore, but a room full of questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. The night was quiet in that way. Only small towns could be no traffic. No hum of distant highways, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere blocks away. Marissa had been sitting on the couch with a book in her lap, though she'd been reading the same paragraph over and over without really taking it in. The house felt bigger at night, the absence of another voice echoing more in the dark. It was close to midnight when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the creak of the old floorboards shifting as the temperature dropped. But then it came. Again, deliberate this time, a soft, steady thump of footsteps across the front porch. She froze, her hand tightening around the edge of the book. The sound wasn't hurried or careless. It was measured, like someone trying not to be noticed, but unable to move completely without sound. She glanced toward the front door where the light from the street lamp bled in through the small window. At the top, setting the book aside, she rose slowly, careful not to let her own steps betray her presence. She crossed the living room in the dim light, straining to hear. The boards on the porch gave another faint groan, followed by silence. Whoever it was had stopped moving. Marissa's pulse quickened. She thought briefly of calling out, but the idea of breaking the silence felt wrong, dangerous somehow. Instead, she reached the door and peered through the PEEPHOLE. Nothing. The porch was empty. She opened the door, just enough to look outside, the night air cool against her face. The street was still, every house on the block dark, but for the occasional porch light. She stepped out, scanning the yard, the sidewalk, the stretch of road beyond. No movement, no shadow retreating into the dark. It was only when she turned back toward the door that she saw a single piece of paper. Folded once, wedged tightly into the frame, just above the knob. It was placed too carefully to have been caught there by the wind. She hesitated before pulling it free, half expecting it to be blank or scrawled with something crude. The paper was plain, the fold crisp. She stepped back inside, locking the door behind her before she unfolded it. The handwriting was quick, uneven, as if written in a hurry. Only 7 words: "Get out of town. He's in deep trouble." She read it twice, her eyes tracing the letters as if they might rearrange into something less alarming. The he was not named, but she didn't need it to be. Every part of her knew exactly who it meant. She sank into the chair by the window, the note still in her hand, and stared out at the porch, as if the writer might still be there, watching. Her mind spun with possibilities. Someone connected to Daniel's work, a neighbor who'd overheard something, a stranger with a misplaced warning. The house seemed to listen with her. The refrigerator's low hum and the faint tick of the clock marking the only passing moments. She thought about the locked drawer she had opened days before, the contracts, the withdrawals, the legal notices. The pieces didn't form a complete picture, but the shape of it was starting to emerge, and it wasn't one she liked. After a while, she folded the note again and set it on the coffee table, as if keeping it in sight would stop it from being real. She left the living room light on when she went to bed. the glow stretching down the hallway in a thin, pale line. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house made her eyes snap open, every shadow shifting in the wind outside, pulling her closer to wakefulness. By morning, she wasn't sure if she'd dreamed more footsteps on the porch or if they'd been real, but the note was still there, its edges curling slightly in the early sunlight, proof that something or someone had crossed the line between her life and whatever Daniel had left behind. Marissa sat at the kitchen table. The note spread out in front of her as though distance might make it easier to decipher. In the soft morning light, the hurried scrawl looked even more uneven. The ink slightly smudged where the writer's hand must have brushed against it. Get out of town, he's in deep trouble. 7 words, but they carried a weight that made her stomach twist. She traced the edge of the paper with one finger, her mind circling the same questions it had the night before. Who had left it? Why here? And why now? The careful placement in the doorframe suggested intention someone wanted her to find it, but not anyone else. And the rushed handwriting, the uneven pressure of the pennet, was as if the person hadn't wanted to linger long. Enough to write more, she tried to picture the scene from the outside. The quiet porch, under the dim glow of the street lamp. The faint creak of the boards under someone's weight. A quick glance toward the street to make sure no one was watching. The folded paper slipped into the doorframe with a precision that made it impossible to miss. Then gone again, disappearing into the stillness. The wording stuck in her mind. Get out of town, not be careful, not watch yourself, but a direct instruction, as if leaving was the only option worth considering. And he's in deep trouble. Not Daniel might be in trouble, but is present tense. Certain she stood and carried the note to the window above the sink, holding it up to the light. The paper was ordinary, torn from a pad, the kind sold in any office supply store. No watermark, no letterhead. The pen was black, ballpoint, the kind that left faint grooves in the paper if you pressed hard enough. She tilted it until she could see the faint indentations. There were no words from a previous page, no accidental marks to give her a clue. Setting it down again, she thought about the locked drawer she had opened days ago, about the business. Contracts, the bank withdrawals, the legal notices. None of it had told a full story, but it had been enough to suggest that Daniel's life had threads she'd never seen. Threads that might now be unraveling. She imagined calling him, reading the words aloud, demanding to know what kind of trouble was closing in. But she could already hear his voice in her mind, the easy deflection, the scoff that would make her feel ridiculous for even asking. He'd tell her to ignore it, that people liked to stir up drama. And then, somehow, he'd find a way to make her the problem. Instead, she poured herself coffee, though the first sip was bitter in a way that had nothing to do with the roast. The note lay on the table beside her mug, the edges curling slightly. It felt wrong to throw it away, but leaving it out in the open made her uneasy, as if it might draw attention from someone else who wasn't meant to see it. She slid it into the middle drawer of the sideboard, under a stack of old utility bills, out of sight, but close enough that she could retrieve it if she needed to. The day moved on around her. Cars passed outside. A delivery truck idled down the block. A neighbor raked leaves into a slow-growing pile. It all looked normal from the window, but the normalcy felt thin, like a film stretched too tight over something waiting to break through by evening. She found herself checking the porch more than once, stepping to the door and looking out as if the note's author might return with an explanation. But the street stayed empty, the porch still. She turned the deadbolt each time she came back inside, the sound of the lock sliding into place offering only a small measure of reassurance. That night, as she lay in bed, the words replayed in her mind with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Get out of town. A warning, maybe even a plea. But from whom, and for whose sake, hers or his? She didn't have an answer, only the uneasy knowledge that whoever had written it knew more than she did, and that their message was only the beginning of something she might not be able to avoid. The knock came in the late afternoon, firm but unhurried, the kind that announced someone who had decided they would be heard. Marissa hesitated in the hallway, one hand hovering over the doorknob. Visitors were rare now, and unannounced ones, rarer still. Through the narrow pane of glass beside the door, she saw a man standing on the porch. He was in his 50s, maybe older, dressed in a worn tweed jacket over a shirt that had once been crisp but had softened with age. His posture was straight, his expression neither warm nor threatening, just intent. When she opened the door, he gave a small nod, as though confirming something he'd already guessed. "Mrs. Kerrigan." His voice was low, even carrying the weight of someone accustomed to measured conversation. "I'm Marissa," she said, the formality of her married name catching in her throat. "I'm Charles Morton. I was a business partner of your husband's." Or rather, he amended with a faint, rueful smile, his former partner. She studied him for a moment, trying to place the name. Daniel had never mentioned a Charles Morton. Then again, Daniel's version of his business dealings was often selective. "What can I do for you?" Charles glanced past her, toward the quiet hallway beyond, and then back. This isn't really something for the porch. It was a calculated choice, letting him in. She waited for a moment before stepping aside. "All right, the kitchen." He followed her in, his eyes moving over the space with a kind of polite disinterest, as though cataloging the details without judging them. She gestured toward a chair, and he sat, resting his hands loosely on the table. "I'll get straight to it," he began. "I haven't seen Daniel in over a year. We ended our partnership under 10th circumstances. I thought that chapter was closed, but recently, things have started resurfacing." "What kind of things?" she asked, careful to keep her voice neutral. He leaned back slightly, watching her as if gauging how much she already knew. "Missing funds. Deals that were made under our company's name after I had already pulled out. Paperwork that doesn't add up. Signatures that, let's just say, look suspiciously similar to your husband's." The air in the kitchen seemed to tighten. Marissa sat down opposite him. "Why come to me?" "Because," he said, "I think you might be closer to the fallout than you realize. These weren't small errors, Mrs. Kerrigan. We're talking about substantial sums and contracts tied to companies no one can seem to locate. Someone's been moving money around, and from what I've been able to piece together, Daniel's at the center of it." Her mind flicked to the locked drawer she had opened days ago. "If you're looking for him," she said slowly, "he's not here." "I'm not here to find him," Charles replied. "I'm here to warn you. Whatever Daniel's involved in, it's drawn the attention of people who don't care much about the finer points of legality. And in their eyes, you're still tied to him. That makes you a liability or a leverage point." The words settled heavily between them. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," he answered, "that if I were you, I'd start putting some distance between myself and anything with his name on it, accounts, property, even the people he's been dealing with. Because if he doesn't surface soon to answer for what's missing, someone's going to start knocking on doors, yours included." Marissa didn't reply right away. She watched him, trying to decide whether he was telling her the whole truth, or only the parts that served his purpose. But the certainty in his tone and the quiet urgency in his eyes wasn't something she could easily dismiss. When he finally stood to leave, he pulled a card from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "If you hear from him, call me, not the police, me. I'll know what to do with the information." She didn't promise anything. She simply nodded, walking him to the door. After he was gone, she stood in the kitchen for a long time, the card lying on the table where he'd left it, his words looping in her head. Missing funds, fraudulent deals, people who wouldn't care about the law. The house was quiet again, but the air felt different, as if something had shifted. She picked up the card and turned it over in her hand. The print was plain, just his name and a phone number. No company listed, no title. She slipped it into the same drawer where she had hidden the anonymous note. 2 warnings now, different voices, but both pointing in the same direction, and both telling her, in their own way, that whatever Daniel had been doing before he left was far from over. The next morning, Marissa pulled the box of Daniel's papers onto the kitchen table, the weight of it thudding against the wood. She hadn't intended to look through them again so soon, but Charles's visit had shifted something in her. His voice, steady but edged with urgency, had stayed with her through the night. Missing funds, fraudulent deals, and the quiet warning that she was still tethered to him, whether she wanted to be or not. She opened the folders, spreading the contents into small, manageable stacks. The business contracts were the first she reached for. The dates along the tops of the pages stood out now in a way they hadn't before. She began writing them down in a notepad columns of numbers, neatly aligned. March 12th, April 3rd, June 27th, August 15th. The months and days ranged over several years, and each one had been stamped or signed in Daniel's distinctive slanting handwriting. From memory, she began cross-referencing them with his so-called business trips. She didn't have his old travel records, but she had her own recollections: the weeks when his suitcase was in the front hall, when the garage stayed empty for days, when she'd made dinner for one without expecting a call. It was strange how clearly the gaps stood out once she started thinking about them. She made a second list, jotting down where he'd said he was going. The names came easily at first. Chicago in March, supposedly for a conference. San Diego in June for a client pitch. A quick trip to Boston one November. The more she wrote, the more a pattern began to form. Subtle at first, but unmistakable the longer she stared at it. Many of the trips, far more than coincidence could explain, had been to the same two cities. Not once or twice, but repeatedly. Sometimes only a few weeks apart. He'd never mentioned clients in those places. In fact, when she thought about it, he'd barely spoken of the trips at all, beyond vague comments about meetings and late nights. She underlined the two city names in her notes, the ink digging slightly into the paper. The more she looked, the less the contracts made sense. Several listed companies she'd never heard of. A few had incomplete addresses, nothing more than a city and a postal code. One didn't have a company name at all, just a description of consulting services rendered, and a signature. It was all too loose, too imprecise for someone like Daniel, who had always liked the appearance of order. She flipped back to the financial statements she'd found in the locked drawer. The deposits and withdrawals lined up too neatly with the dates of his travel. Money came in, sometimes in large sums, a few days before he left. Money went out often just as large, within a day or two of his return. The amounts varied, but the rhythm was consistent, almost mechanical. She thought about Charles's words again. Contracts tied to companies no one can seem to locate. She opened her laptop and typed one of the company names into the search bar. Nothing. Not a website, not a directory listing, not even a stray mention on a forgotten news page. She tried another. Again, nothing. It was as if they existed only on Daniel's paperwork. Marissa leaned back in her chair, the notepad and papers spread in front of her like pieces of a puzzle. The image was still incomplete, but she could feel its outline taking shape. Daniel hadn't been traveling to meet clients. He'd been going to those same two cities for something else, something that required money to be moved in and out quickly, and without leaving a clear trail. She picked up her pen and circled the dates where everything overlapped: contract signed, trip taken, money transferred. There were more circles than she expected. Too many to dismiss as coincidence. The late afternoon light was fading when she finally pushed the papers into a neat pile. The evidence wasn't enough to prove anything, not yet, but it was enough to know she'd been kept in the dark. Enough to know that Daniel's business trips had been about something far different than he'd ever admitted. As she slid the notepad into the drawer with the anonymous note and Charles's card, she realized she was no longer just a bystander. To whatever Daniel had been involved in, whether she wanted to be or not, she was already tangled in it. And each piece of the puzzle she uncovered was pulling her deeper into a story she hadn't asked to be part of. It was nearly 10 when Marissa heard the knock-sharp rapid, not the kind that waited politely for an answer. She had been in the living room, the TV on low, a mug of tea cooling on the side table. The sound jolted her upright. Few people came by after dark, and none without calling first. She moved to the door cautiously, glancing through the narrow pane of glass before opening it. Talia stood on the porch, her glossy hair pulled into a messy knot that left strands falling across her face, even in the weak light from the overhead. Bald Marissa could see how pale she looked. Her eyes darted past Marissa, scanning the street as if she expected someone to be following her. Talia's voice was lower than Marissa remembered. Stripped of the easy confidence she'd worn like a badge the last time they crossed paths in town. Marissa hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "What's going on?" Talia moved quickly into the hallway, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest. She didn't sit when they reached the kitchen, just hovered by the counter. Glancing toward the windows, "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't serious," she began, her tone clipped, like someone rehearsing in her head before speaking aloud. "It's about Daniel." Marissa stayed by the table, watching her. "I gathered he's different lately," Talia said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I mean, I knew he could be moody, but this is something else. He's jumpy, always checking his phone, stepping outside to make calls. He doesn't tell me where he's going half the time, and when he comes back, he's either tense and quiet or acting like nothing happened." Marissa kept her expression neutral. "That sounds like Daniel." "This isn't just temper or secrets," Talia insisted, her voice rising slightly before she glanced at the window again and lowered it. "I think he's in trouble, real trouble. He mentioned something the other night about owing people. He didn't say who, just that they weren't the kind of people you ignore." The words made the air in the kitchen feel heavier. Marissa thought of the note left in her doorframe of Charles Morton's visit, of the mismatched contracts and untraceable companies. "Dangerous people," she repeated, her tone flat. Talia nodded, her eyes flicking toward the door as though someone might knock again at any moment. "I didn't sign up for this, I thought. I don't know what I thought, that it would be fun, exciting, but I've seen enough to know when something's about to go bad." Marissa took a slow sip of her tea, though it had gone cold. "So, why tell me?" "Because you're still his wife," Talia said bluntly. "If they can't get to him, they might come looking for you, or for anyone close to him. You should be careful." It was an odd mix of warning and deflection, looking out for herself while making sure the weight of Daniel's problems wasn't hers alone. Marissa studied her for a moment, noting the faint tremor in her hands, the way her gaze never settled. For more than a few seconds, whatever was going on, Talia was afraid, and not just for Daniel. "I can take care of myself," Marissa said finally. Talia gave a small, humorless laugh. "I used to think I could too." She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Just be smart about it. Don't assume you're not part of this just because you didn't choose to be." Without waiting for an answer, she moved back, toward the front door. Marissa followed, opening it to the cool night air. Talia paused on the porch, scanning the street again before descending the steps. Marissa stood there a moment after she left, listening to the sound of Talia's footsteps fading down the sidewalk. The street was quiet again, the night still, but the conversation lingered like a shadow in the room she'd just left. When she closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place, she found herself thinking about the way Talia's voice had tightened when she'd said dangerous people. It wasn't gossip or speculation, it was the certainty of someone who had already seen enough to know exactly what that meant. The knock this time was slower, heavier, the kind that didn't rush but carried authority all the same. Marissa had been upstairs sorting laundry, the steady hum of the dryer filling the hallway when it sounded. She paused on the landing, listening. Whoever it was didn't knock again, but something about the rhythm made her certain they wouldn't be leaving. Without speaking to her, she came down the stairs, her steps measured, and glanced through the glass pane beside the door. Two men stood on the porch, both in dark jackets, their badges clipped visibly to their belts. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair close-cropped and graying at the temples. The other younger, with a notebook in hand and a gaze that moved. Quickly, over the front of the house, as if memorizing every detail, Marissa opened the door part-way, just enough to lean against the frame. "Can I help you?" The older one spoke first, Mrs. Kerrigan. Her jaw tightened slightly at the name, but she nodded. "I'm Detective Lawson, and this is Officer Pina. We're looking for your husband, Daniel Kerrigan. Is he here?" "No," she said simply. "Do you know where he might be?" Pina's tone was polite, but direct, his pen already poised above the page. "I haven't seen him since the day he left." Lawson tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And when was that? 3 weeks ago? Maybe a little more? And you haven't spoken to him since?" "No," she replied, her voice steady. "Pe." Na jotted something down. "We have some questions about his recent activities. It's important we find him." Marissa kept her expression neutral, though the phrase recent activities twisted in her gut. "I can't help you. I don't know where he is." Lawson glanced past her into the hallway, his gaze lingering a beat too long. "Do you mind if we come in? Just to talk?" "I do mind," she said, her tone sharpening. "If you have questions, you can ask them here." There was a brief pause before he nodded. "All right. Do you know if he's been in contact with anyone since he left? Friends, family, business associates?" She thought of Talia's visit, of Charles Morton's warning, of the folded note still hidden in the sideboard drawer. Not that I'm aware of. Lawson exchanged a glance with Pena, then leaned in slightly. Mrs. Kerrigan, I'm going to be honest with you. We believe your husband may be involved in some illegal financial activity. There's a warrant out for his arrest. If you're protecting him, that could cause you trouble down the line. I'm not protecting him, she said, her voice low but firm. I told you I don't know where he is. Pena scribbled again, the sound of the pen against paper oddly loud in the stillness. If he contacts you, it's important you call us right away. Marissa nodded once, but didn't speak. Lawson reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, holding it between two fingers. She took it, her eyes flicking over the printed name and number before slipping it into her pocket without comment. They lingered a moment longer, as if weighing whether to push further, but finally stepped back. We'll be in touch, Lawson, said Dot. She closed the door after them, waiting until she heard the crunch of their boots on the walkway and the low murmur of their voices fading toward the street. Only then did she move to the window, peering through the sheer curtain. The two men stood by an unmarked sedan, speaking in quiet tones before getting in. The car rolled away slowly, disappearing at the corner. Marissa stayed there a moment longer, the card in her pocket feeling heavier than it should. The image of their faces, the way Lawson's eyes had lingered on hers as if searching for a crack, stayed with her. She went back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and stared at the drawer where the note, Charles's card, and her own scattered records lay hidden. Now the police were in the picture. Official questions, official warnings. And yet, even with their visit, she had the uneasy sense that the danger Daniel had brought into her life was still more shadow than form, and that what lay ahead wouldn't be solved by a knock at the door. The discovery came on a gray afternoon, the kind where the light never seemed to shift, and the air felt heavier than it should. Marissa had been in the garage for hours, sorting through the clutter Daniel had left behind, boxes half filled with old tools, coils of extension cords, chipped mugs from long-forgotten vacations. The space smelled faintly of oil and cardboard, the cold concrete seeping through the soles of her shoes. She was lifting a box from the top of a stack when it shifted awkwardly in her arms, the contents rattling against each other. Setting it down on the workbench, she pried open the flaps and found it filled with an odd assortment of things: loose screws, receipts curled at the edges, a few pens, a pocket knife. It was the kind of catch-all box where Daniel tossed anything he didn't want to deal with but couldn't quite throw away as she dug through it. Her fingers brushed something cold and metallic at the bottom. She fished it out, holding it up to the weak light filtering through the dusty garage window. It was a small brass key, smooth from handling, with a rectangular tag attached by a thin wire loop. The tag was stamped with a single number, 214. She turned it over in her palm, trying to place it. It wasn't a house key, too short, too rounded, not for a safe deposit box either. She thought about the locks she knew, the shed out back, the old file cabinet in the study, the padlock on the basement door. None of them matched. The number on the tag tugged at her memory, faint but insistent. She stepped back from the workbench and stared at the key, her mind flipping through possibilities. A hotel room? No, the tag was metal, not plastic. A locker at a gym. Daniel hadn't set foot in one in years. And then it came to her storage units. She'd seen keys like this before, the kind you rented by the month and forgot about until you needed whatever you'd hidden away. The thought made her uneasy. Daniel had never mentioned renting a storage space, and yet here was the key, hidden among useless odds and ends, as if he hadn't wanted it to stand out. She set the box aside and went inside. Placing the key on the kitchen table, gleamed faintly against the wood, its presence both ordinary and strange. She opened her laptop and searched for storage facilities in the area. There were several within a half-hour drive, all with rows of numbered units. She imagined walking into one, the key in her hand, the roll-up door clattering open to reveal what? More of his papers, items bought with money he hadn't earned, or something worse, something she wasn't ready to see. Her eyes drifted toward the drawer where the anonymous note, Charles Morton's card, and her own scribbled timelines lay, hidden. This key felt like it belonged there too. Another piece of the puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to finish. She thought about the police visit, about Lawson's eyes on her as he'd asked if she knew where Daniel was. If she told them about the key, they'd take it, follow the lead, and whatever they found would be out of her hands. But there was a part of her more stubborn that wanted to know first, not out of loyalty to Daniel, but because she hated the idea of everyone else knowing more about the mess he'd left than she did. The afternoon wore on, the light dimming until the kitchen settled into shadow. The key sat between her hands as she traced the number on the tag with her thumb, 214. It was small enough to slip into her coat pocket, light enough to forget about if she chose to, but she knew she wouldn't. Whatever was locked behind that door had been important enough for Daniel to keep hidden, and if the past weeks had taught her anything, it was that the things he hid tended to be the ones that mattered most. When she finally rose from the table, she didn't put the key in the drawer with the others. Instead, she slipped it into the small zipped compartment of her handbag, the place where she kept the few items she didn't want to lose. Its weight there was barely noticeable, but its presence was sharp in her mind, carrying the quiet promise that it would lead her somewhere she hadn't been before, and perhaps somewhere she didn't want to go. The storage facility was tucked behind a strip of auto shops and warehouses, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Marissa pulled into the narrow lot, her tires crunching over loose gravel. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. A chain-link fence surrounded the rows of units, each door painted a dull green that had faded under years of sun. Driven past 3 other facilities before settling on this one, half out of instinct, half because it matched the picture she'd formed in her head when she first held the brass key. The office was empty except for a tired-looking clerk behind a counter, who barely glanced up when she showed the key and gave the number. The man typed something into his computer, then slid a clipboard toward her to sign a visitor log. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. Unit 214 was near the far corner, away from the main road. The corridor between the rows of metal doors was quiet, except for the faint hum of a vending machine somewhere in the distance. Marissa stood in front of the door for a moment, the key cool in her hand. The padlock was simple, the kind you could buy in any hardware store. She slid the key in, turned it, and heard the small, clean click of the mechanism releasing. The metal door rattled as she lifted it, the sound echoing off the concrete. The smell hit her first dust paper, something faintly metallic. The light inside was dim, the only illumination coming from the strip of daylight spilling in through the open door. Stacks of boxes lined the back wall, some labeled with dates, others with vague descriptions like supplies or records. The handwriting on the labels was Daniel's, neat and deliberate. She stepped inside, running her fingers over the nearest box before pulling off the lid. Inside were neatly organized file folders, each stuffed with documents, contracts, invoices, bank statements. Some were stamped with company names she didn't recognize, others had no headers at all. She moved to the next stack, lifting a box that felt heavier than it should. When she opened it, her breath caught. Bundles of cash were stacked inside, each one wrapped with a paper band. She didn't count them, but the sheer number made her pulse quicken. The bills looked new, crisp, and they were arranged with a kind of precision that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The third box held something different, a black laptop, its surface scuffed, but still in good condition. A charging cable was coiled beside it, along with an external hard drive marked only with a strip of masking tape. The tape had a single word written in marker accounts. She sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the laptop. It powered on, but almost immediately, a password prompt filled the screen. She tried a few obvious guesses: birthdays, initials, the name of Daniel's old business, but each one was met with the same rejection. The hard drive was no better. When she plugged it in, a small window popped up asking for an encryption key. She stared at the screen, the quiet hum of the laptop filling the stillness. Whatever was on here wasn't meant to be seen by anyone who didn't already know how to unlock it. For a long moment, she just sat there, surrounded by boxers that felt heavier now than they had when she'd lifted them. This was more than financial trouble. This was deliberate concealment. And whatever Daniel had been doing, he'd been careful enough to make sure the most valuable pieces of it couldn't be accessed without him. She closed the laptop, sliding it and the hard drive back into the box. As she replaced the lid, her gaze fell again on the bundles of cash. The stacks of paper that formed a paper trail no one had yet followed. When she stepped outside and pulled the metal door closed, the lock snapping back into place, she felt The strange weight of having seen too much and yet knowing far too little. The key went back into her bag. But the memory of what she'd found wouldn't be tucked away so easily. She walked back to her car, her shoes crunching against the gravel, and started the engine. The facility faded from view in the rear view mirror, but the image of those boxes, of the neat stacks of cash and the dark screen demanding a password stayed sharp in her mind, refusing to fade with the distance. It was early evening when the knock came, a measured, deliberate sound that didn't rush, but carried enough weight to make Marissa set down the dish she'd been drying. She wiped her hands on a towel as she crossed the kitchen, already suspecting it wasn't a neighbor or a delivery. Through the narrow glass beside the front door, she saw a man standing on the porch. He wasn't in uniform, but the badge clipped to his belt caught the porch light. When she opened the door, he gave a polite nod. "Mrs. Kerrigan, I'm Detective Miguel Alvarez. May I come in?" Marissa hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Alvarez entered with the quiet assurance of someone used to walking into other people's spaces. He was in his 40s, lean, with dark hair combed neatly back and eyes that scanned the room without seeming hurried. They moved into the living room. He didn't sit until she gestured to the armchair opposite the sofa. When he settled, he pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, but didn't open it right away. "I appreciate you talking to me," he began, his tone even but weighted. "I'll get straight to the point. We're investigating your husband, Daniel Kerrigan, for fraud and embezzlement." And now he paused, meeting her eyes, suspected money laundering. Marissa kept her expression still. "I haven't seen him since the day he left," she said. "I understand," Alvarez replied, "but I also think you may have seen things, even if you didn't realize their importance at the time." He leaned forward slightly. "We have evidence that Daniel moved large sums of money through shell companies over the past 2 years. Funds were withdrawn in cash or transferred to accounts overseas. Some of those companies on paper don't exist beyond a name and a post office box." Marissa thought of the boxers in the storage unit, the contracts with vague addresses, the bundles of cash, the encrypted laptop. She didn't speak, but her mind replayed the sight of those stacks, the cool metallic smell of paper and secrecy. Mrs. Kerrigan Alvarez continued, "In cases like this, the people closest to the suspect sometimes get pulled in not because they were involved, but because the suspect used their name, their accounts, their property. If Daniel tied anything to you, even without your knowledge, you could face serious legal complications." She folded her hands in her lap. "What exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you've come across anything that could help us locate him or understand the scope of what he's been doing. Documents, financial records, storage spaces, anything that didn't seem right." Her instinct was to keep quiet, not to protect Daniel, but because part of her still wanted to know for herself what all of it meant. She wasn't ready to hand over the key details, not yet. "I've found some papers." "Yes," she said carefully, "but nothing I can make sense of." Alvarez studied her for a long moment. "Even things you can't make sense of can matter. We've already traced a number of his transactions to cash withdrawals that match travel dates. We believe he's been moving physical currency to avoid detection." His words mirrored her own discoveries almost too closely. She felt the smallest flicker of unease. If they knew this much already, how long would it be before they found the storage unit on their own? "I'll think about it," she said finally. He nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. Standing, he reached into his pocket and placed a card on the coffee table. "If he contacts you, or if you decide to share what you found, call me directly. The longer he's out there, the more dangerous this becomes, not just for him." After he left, Marissa remained in the living room, staring at the card. The house felt quieter than before, the air heavier. She slipped the card into the same drawer where the anonymous note and Charles Morton's warning were kept, but she knew the visit had shifted something. Alvarez's calm tone hadn't masked the urgency in his words. Daniel wasn't just a man who'd left her for someone else. He was a man running out of time, and she was holding pieces of a puzzle the police were desperate to complete. The first sign that something was wrong came when Marissa's card was declined at the grocery store. It wasn't the kind of store where people made a scene, but the cashier's polite, practiced smile as she said, "It's not going through, maybe try again," made heat rise to her cheeks. She tried again. The same result. The line behind her grew uncomfortably still, the shuffle of feet and rustle of bags pausing in that way people do when they sense something awkward. She paid in cash, keeping her voice even as she asked the cashier to set aside the rest of her items. Once outside, the cool air felt sharper than it should. Sitting in her car, she pulled out her phone and opened the banking app. A red banner flashed across the top of the screen. Account access restricted, please. Contact your branch. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment before she pressed it. The hold music was tinny, an endless loop that made the seconds drag. When a voice finally came on the line, it belonged to a woman with a tone so neutral it almost felt rehearsed. Mrs. Kerrigan, your account has been temporarily frozen pending an internal review. This is due to flagged transactions linked to ongoing investigations. Marissa's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of transactions? I'm not at liberty to provide specifics, but I can tell you they involve multiple large transfers from and to accounts in your name, as well as accounts connected to your husband. Her stomach nodded. Those transfers weren't mine, given that this is a joint account. Any activity, whether initiated by you or your co-account holder, can affect both parties, the woman replied. You should be aware that certain transactions are under federal review. It would be in your best interest to speak with legal counsel. The words landed with a cold clarity. Daniel's choices hadn't just touched her life in an abstract. Emotional wave, they were spilling over into her name, her credit, her legal standing. She could almost hear Alvarez's voice from the night before. If Daniel tied anything to you, even without your knowledge, you could face serious legal complications. After the call ended, she sat in the driver's seat, the groceries in the back seat forgotten. Her mind raced through every bill she'd scheduled, every payment that depended on that account. The mortgage, utilities, insurance. She wasn't sure which would bounce first. Back at home, she spread her own records across. The kitchen table bills, receipts, the few statements she'd saved. She began circling dates in red ink, marking every time she'd been away from home when Daniel had been handling things. Those dates lined up icily with some of the times she knew he'd been traveling to the same two cities. She thought about the boxers in the storage unit, the bundles of cash, the encrypted laptop. All of it pointed to something far bigger than she had wanted to believe. If the account was frozen now, it meant the investigation had reached the point where she wasn't just a bystander. She was tethered to him in the eyes of the law, her name stamped beside his on paperwork she hadn't signed. The realization was like a cold hand closing around her throat. She made a quiet decision then not to call Daniel, not to warn him, but to protect herself. She pulled a legal pad toward her and began a list of everything she'd found. The documents, the cash, the hard drive, the note. She didn't know yet if she would hand it to Alvarez, but the act of writing it down felt like building a wall between herself and whatever came. Next, by the time the sun dipped low and the kitchen was bathed in a thin amber light, the weight of the situation had settled in her chest. Daniel had left her for someone else, yes, but the more she uncovered, the more it seemed he'd been setting her up for something much worse. And now, with her account frozen and her name tangled in his mess, she had no choice but to act before the line between his crimes and her life blurred beyond recognition. The call came just after dusk, when the house had settled into that muted stillness that made every sound seem sharper. Marissa was in the kitchen, rinsing the last of the dishes, when her phone buzzed across the counter. The name on the screen gave her a Pasilia they had spoken only once before, face to face. In that uneasy visit weeks ago when Talia had shown up at her door pale and anxious, Marissa answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was unsteady, the kind that carried the weight of someone trying not to unravel. Marissa, it's Talia. I know, Marissa said quietly, resting one hand on the edge of the counter. There was a long inhale, followed by a shaky exhale. They came to see me today, the police, 2 of them. They asked about Daniel, where he's been, who he's talked to, what I know about his business. Her words tumbled out quickly, as if she feared she'd lose the courage to say them. If she stopped, Marissa stayed silent, letting her continue. They said my name showed up on some documents, Talia went on, her voice cracking. Bank transfers, lease agreements. I never signed anything, Marissa, I swear. But they showed me copies my signature, or something that looked like it, and I. She stopped, the sound of her breath shaky in the quiet line. "I think he's been using me as a cover," just like she didn't finish the sentence. Marissa felt the shift in her tone, the edge of realization cutting through whatever illusions Talia had still been holding. "When did you last see him?" she asked. 3 days ago. He came by late, didn't stay long, said he had things to take care of. He looked nervous, kept checking his phone. I asked what was going on, and he just told me to trust him." There was a bitter laugh, short and without humor. "Trust him, that's rich." In the background, Marissa could hear faint traffic noise. The occasional honk. Talia was outside somewhere, maybe pacing a sidewalk. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't think I'm the only one he's dragging into this," Talia said, her voice steadier now but threaded with urgency. "And because you need to be careful. If he's using my name, he's probably using yours too. The police, they think I know where he is. I don't, but I could tell they weren't sure they believed me." Marissa's eyes flicked toward the drawer in the dining room, the one where she'd tucked the key, the note, Charles's card. Talia's words felt like another weight added to a pile already straining under its own pressure. "I recorded the call," Talia said suddenly. "What? When the police first left, I called Daniel. I needed to hear him explain. I kept the recorder on my phone running. I don't know why, maybe I just wanted proof that I wasn't crazy. He was angry I called, told me not to say anything to anyone, that it would blow over if I just stayed quiet. But then he slipped. He mentioned keeping the accounts in my name to spread things out." Marissa's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you still have it?" "Yes. I don't know what to do with it. If I give it to the police, I'm admitting I knew enough to suspect something. If I keep it, I'm waiting for him to come back? For them to knock again?" There was a pause, long enough for the ambient noise of Talia's surroundings to fill the space between them. "I don't trust him anymore," she said finally, the words soft but certain. "And I don't think you should either. If they come for me next, they'll come for you too." Marissa didn't make promises. She didn't offer reassurances. She just told Talia to keep the recording safe. Somewhere, Daniel couldn't reach it. When the call ended, she stayed in the kitchen, the phone still in her hand, her mind running over every implication. Daniel wasn't just hiding. He was maneuvering, using names and faces like tools, keeping himself one step removed, while others bore the weight of his choices. And now, between the frozen account, the storage unit, and Talia's recorded proof, Marissa could feel the circle tightening, not just around him, but around anyone still tethered to his name. It was just after noon when Mrs. Latham from next door knocked, holding a small flash drive between her fingers. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed everything not out of malice, but because years of living alone had made her attuned to the rhythms of the street. Her knock was light but urgent, and when Marissa opened the door, she leaned in slightly, her voice lowered. "I think you should see this." They moved into the living room, and Mrs. Latham placed the flash drive on the coffee table like it was something fragile. "I didn't mean to snoop," she began, "but my security cameras caught someone near your porch the other night. When I looked closer, I realized it was Daniel. And, well, it wasn't the first time." Marissa felt a prickle of unease. "How many times?" Mrs. Latham shrugged, the movement small and hesitant. 3, maybe 4 in the last 2 weeks. Always late, always quiet. "I wasn't sure if you knew." They plugged the drive into Marissa's laptop, and the video folder opened with a series of time-stamped clips. The first began with the grainy view of the street in front of Marissa's house, bathed in the pale glow of the street lamp. At 1:13 a.m., a dark sedan eased into view, its headlights dimmed. Daniel got out, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. His shoulders hunched as if he didn't want to be recognized even by the camera. He likely didn't know it was there. He moved quickly, crossing the yard in long, purposeful strides. In his hand was a white envelope. He slipped it into the corner of the doorframe, glanced over his shoulder once, and then walked back to the car. The engine stayed idling until he drove off, the sound of tires faint through the camera's audio feed. The second clip was much the same, different night, same time, same movements. Only this time, when he approached the door, he paused longer, glancing at the windows before leaving the envelope. "Have you opened them?" Mrs. Latham asked gently. Marissa nodded slowly. "I found one. It was just a note, no name, telling me to get out of town. I didn't know there were more." In the third video, He appeared to hesitate before leaving the envelope, his weight shifting from one foot to the other. His head turned toward the camera's direction, but the brim of his cap hid most of his face. This visit was short or less than a minute from the moment he parked to when he drove away. The final clip was the most unsettling. It was from only 2 nights ago. Daniel stepped out of the sedan, carrying not one envelope, but 2. He placed one in the doorframe and the other directly on the porch floor. Before leaving, he crouched briefly, as if checking something near the threshold. Then he left without looking back. When the videos ended, Marissa leaned back on the couch, the air in the room feeling heavier. She'd thought she was done with seeing him anywhere near her home. But here he was, in the shadows, delivering messages she hadn't asked for. "Do you want me to keep watching for him?" Mrs. Latham asked. "Yes," Marissa said, her voice steady, "and keep the originals. Don't delete anything." After Mrs. Latham left, Marissa sat at the kitchen table with her laptop still open. Each time, her attention lingered on his posture, the way he moved like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and how little time he had to do it. The unanswered question hung in her mind: were these envelopes meant to warn her, to scare her, or to implicate her with Daniel? All 3 felt possible. And now, with the proof on her screen, she realized that whether she wanted to or not, she had one more piece of his shadowed world in her hands. One that might matter to the people already closing in on him. The envelope was plain, unmarked, except for the faint smudge of what looked like oil from someone's fingers. It had been wedged tightly into the doorframe, just like in the neighbors' videos. Marissa sat at the kitchen table with it in front of her, the late afternoon light slanting across the paper. For a long while, she didn't touch it, just studied the edges, wondering if it was another cryptic warning or something meant to rattle her into making a mistake. When she finally slid a letter opener under the flap, the paper inside crackled in a way that made her skin prickle. It was a single sheet, folded in thirds, the handwriting unmistakably Daniel's slanted. Hurried, the ink pressed too hard into the page. But this time, it wasn't a taunt or an empty line meant to confuse her. The first word stopped her. "Breath. I used your name." Her eyes moved over the lines quickly at first, then slowed as the weight of each sentence sank in. He spelled it out in plain language how he had funneled money through their joint account. Through credit lines still in her name, through investments she didn't know existed. He wrote about needing clean accounts, ones the authorities wouldn't look at too closely. Hers had been perfect, he said, because she had never been in trouble, never had so much as a late payment. He didn't ask for forgiveness. The tone wasn't apologetic. It was matter-of-fact, almost like he was explaining it to himself as much as to her. He admitted that some of the money had been stolen, moved from businesses whose owners wouldn't miss it, or from investors too rich to notice the gaps. He described transactions in sums that made her stomach knot, all threaded through accounts with her name attached. Sometimes multiple times in the same month. The most chilling part came halfway down the page. "If they catch you in the net, tell them I forged everything. That's the truth, but they won't believe it unless I'm already gone." She read that line 3 times, the words turning over in her mind. It was a confession, yes, but also a shield he was trying to place between them. Shield that worked. Only if he disappeared entirely. The implication was clear. If he stayed, she would be collateral damage. If he ran, she might be spared at the bottom. His signature sprawled across the page, the loops larger than usual, almost reckless. The date was 2 nights ago, the same night he'd been caught on camera, crouching by her porch. Marissa set the paper down carefully, as though it might crumble under her fingers. The kitchen felt smaller, the air tighter. This wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. This was a weapon. If she gave it to the police, it could clear her name, or at least put them on the path to proving she hadn't been a willing participant. But it also meant exposing that she had been in possession of evidence without reporting it immediately. She imagined Detective Alvarez reading it, his calm voice asking why she hadn't come forward sooner. She imagined the sharp skepticism in the eyes of anyone who thought she'd been complicit, and she imagined Daniel somewhere else entirely, laughing at the idea that a single piece of paper could undo the mess he'd made. She read it again, slower this time, noting every date, every transaction he mentioned, the way his choice of words seemed to blur guilt and justification. She noticed he never used the word steal. He wrote moved, redirected, shifted. Even in confession, he was rewriting the language to soften what he'd done. When she finally folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope, her hands were steady. She didn't know yet whether she would hand it over to the police or keep it hidden until she understood the full scope of its value. But she knew one thing with certainty. This was the first time Daniel had put his betrayal in writing. And in the world he'd built where words were slippery and truth was negotiable. That made it more dangerous than anything he'd ever said aloud. Detective Alvarez arrived unannounced. His knock firm, but not hurried, the kind of rhythm that carried both authority and restraint. Marissa opened the door to find him standing there in plain clothes, a folder tucked under one arm, his expression measured. She stepped aside without a word, and he entered, glancing briefly around the room before setting the folder on the kitchen table. He didn't waste time. "We've got enough to bring him in," he said, his voice low, "but we need him to come to us. And right now, he's avoiding anything that smells like law enforcement." Marissa kept her arms crossed, her back leaning against the counter. "So you want me to help you catch him?" Alvarez met her gaze evenly. "Yes, we think he's circling you. The visits your neighbor caught on camera. The envelope sees, not done. Whatever his reasons, he keeps coming back here, even if it's just to leave something on your porch. That's leverage. We can use it." She thought of the videos, the way Daniel moved in and out of frame like a shadow, never staying long enough for anyone to confront him. And what exactly would that involve? "We set the scene so he thinks it's safe to approach you in person," Alvarez explained. "We'll have surveillance in place, officers positioned out of sight. If he comes inside, all the better. Once he's here, we move in." Marissa let the silence stretch, her mind pulling at every possible outcome. "You're asking me to open my door to him? To make him think nothing's changed?" Alvarez nodded. "It's risky. I won't pretend otherwise. But you'll have backup. The second we see him make a move toward the house, we'll be on him. You won't be alone in this?" She moved to the table, pulling out a chair but not sitting. "And if he doesn't show, then we try something else. But from everything we've gathered, his pattern says he will. He's still tied to you somehow. Whether it's guilt, arrogance, or unfinished business, he's not ready to let go." Marissa thought about the confession letter, about Talia's recorded call. She thought about the frozen bank account and the growing stack of documents in her dining room drawer. It all pointed to one thing: Daniel's mistakes had finally backed him into a corner. And corners made people unpredictable. It's a wire, small enough to pin inside your clothes. We'll hear everything. And if it looks like he's about to leave before we can get to him, I need you to keep him talking. Anything you can get him to say about the accounts, the stolen money, will help us lock this down airtight." She picked up the device, turning it over in her hand. It felt lighter than it should, considering the weight of what it represented. "You're sure this will work? It's our best shot at getting him without a chase. And it keeps you in control of the setting." He closed the folder, his tone softening. "I know this isn't easy, but you've been carrying the fallout of what he's done for long enough. This could be the moment it shifts back in your favor." Marissa finally sat down, the device resting in front of her. "Fine, but if we're doing this, we do it on my terms. No barging in early, no scaring him off before he says what needs to be said." Alvarez gave a single nod. Agreed. As they went over the plan, the afternoon light dimmed, shadows stretching across the table. When he left, the kitchen felt quieter than before, but not in the heavy, suffocating way it had in those first days. After Daniel walked out, this silence carried something different: anticipation, edged with the sharp awareness that the next time Daniel came to her door, it wouldn't be to leave another envelope. It would be the moment everything broke open. The house felt different that night, as if it were holding its breath along with her. The lamps cast small, steady pools of light across the living room, leaving the corners in soft shadow. Marissa sat curled in the armchair by the window, a blanket over her legs, though the air wasn't cold. Outside, the street was quiet, the occasional hum of a passing car breaking the stillness. She had agreed to Alvarez's plan, and now all that was left was to wait for morning and for Daniel. But the quiet didn't keep her mind from moving. It drifted, uninvited, to the years when Daniel's voice filled these rooms. Not the charming tone he used for strangers, or the polite words he saved for company, but the cutting remarks that slid in under the guise of humor. She remembered the first time he told her she was lucky to have someone like him, how it had been said with a smile, almost as if he thought she might laugh along. The years had been built on moments like that, small chips, taken from her dignity until she stopped noticing how much of it was gone. He had an artful way of making her doubt her worth, of framing his criticism as advice, his control as protection. He'd tell her she wasn't ready to handle the finances, that she didn't need to worry about the business. It had sounded reasonable then, but now she saw how each of those reassurances had been another lock he placed on a door he never intended her to open. She thought of the times she'd sat across from him at this same table, coffee cooling in her hands, while he scrolled through his phone, barely glancing up. When she'd tried to speak about her day, his responses would trail off into nothing, as though her words didn't carry enough weight to hold his attention. Those small dismissals had been harder to name than his open criticisms, but they had carved deeper lines over the years as the night wore on. She rose and moved quietly through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of framed photos. Some still held images from when they'd first met, two younger faces, smiling at a world they thought they understood. Others she had replaced in the past months, filling frames with pictures of places she'd been on her own or with friends she'd reconnected with after the split. In the kitchen, she stood for a while with her hands resting on the counter, staring at the drawer that now held his confession. The paper was still there, folded back into its envelope, waiting. It was strange how something so light could hold so much power enough to tilt the balance between them after all these years. By midnight, she had made herself tea. She carried the mug back to the armchair, tucking her feet beneath her. The plan with Alvarez circled in her mind, not as a source of fear, but as a fixed point on the horizon. Tomorrow, there would be no pretense left between her and Daniel. Whatever happened when he walked through that door, it would be the last time she saw him without a wall of consequence between them. In the early hours, when the street outside was empty and even the hum of distant traffic had faded, she let her eyes close. Sleep came in brief, restless stretches, each one cut through with fragments of memory. His voice raised in anger, the echo of a slammed door, the sound of his laughter in another room when she wasn't part of the joke. When the faint light of dawn began to edge through the curtains, Marissa was still in the chair. The blanket had slipped to the floor, and the tea had long since cooled. She sat upright, her hands resting on her knees, the quiet resolve of the night before settling into something sharper. Daniel had taken enough from her over the years, her trust, her voice, her sense of safety. Tomorrow, she would take something back. The first light of morning was still thin when Marissa heard the faint sound of tires on the street outside. She had been awake for hours, sitting in the armchair with the blanket over her lap, her eyes fixed on the door as if sheer focus could will the moment into existence. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound inside the house. Outside, the air carried the muted chill of a spring dawn, pale blue just beginning to spill across the sky. When the car door clicked shut, her stomach tightened. She stood slowly, careful not to let her movements make noise. The knock came moments later. Brisk, but not forceful, like someone visiting an old friend. She opened the door, and there he was. Daniel stood with that same easy smile she remembered from the early days, the one he used when he wanted to disarm her. His duffel bag was slung over one shoulder, his shirt untucked, and his hair slightly mussed, as though he had driven straight here without stopping. "Morning, Marissa," he said, as if nothing had happened, as if months hadn't passed since he walked out with those final cutting words. For a moment, neither of them moved. She noticed how calm his eyes looked, how comfortable he seemed. Standing there on her porch, it was a performance. She realized he wasn't here to apologize or to explain. He was here because he thought he still had the right to be. Behind him, movement stirred in the periphery. Two figures stepped from the shadowed side of the house, their pace measured but quick, hands already resting on their belts. A third emerged. From the far corner of the yard, the officers closed in without a word at first, their presence sudden enough to make Daniel stiffen. "What's this?" he asked, his voice pitching upward, a sliver of panic threading through the casual tone. He took a half step back, his eyes darting between the approaching officers. "Daniel Carter," one of them said, his voice even and deliberate. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering." The words landed heavy in the cool air. Daniel's head turned toward. Marissa, confusion and something sharper betrayal flickering across his face. "You called them?" She didn't answer. She stood in the doorway, hands resting lightly on the frame, watching as they took hold of his arms. The metallic snap of the handcuffs cut through the morning. Sharp and final. Daniel's voice grew louder, the calm completely gone now. "This is a mistake." "I didn't." He stopped, catching himself, but the officers didn't slow. They moved him down the porch steps with steady, unyielding hands. Their words clipped and procedural as they read him his rights. Alvarez appeared from near the driveway, his plain clothes blending with the early light. He gave Marissa the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement that the plan had worked. Daniel saw him too and shook his head in disbelief. "You've got nothing," he muttered, but it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. The duffel bag slipped from his shoulder as they guided him toward the car, landing on the grass with a soft thud. One of the officers picked it up, unzipped it briefly, then zipped it again without comment before tossing it into the back seat. Marissa stayed in the doorway until the car pulled away, the red and blue lights reflecting faintly off the pale siding of the house. She didn't wave, didn't call out. The sound of the engine faded, leaving the street empty once more. Inside, the stillness returned, but it wasn't the same as before. This quiet didn't press in on her. It wasn't the kind born from absence or abandonment. It was the quiet that comes when something heavy is finally set down a space newly cleared, waiting for whatever came next. The officers had him by each arm, their grip steady as they guided him toward the waiting patrol car. The early light caught on the steel of the cuffs, throwing small flashes across the driveway. Daniel's steps were slowed, not by resistance, but by the weight of the moment, his head turning just enough to keep her in view. His expression had shifted no trace of the feigned warmth he'd worn when he first appeared at her door. Halfway down the walkway, he stopped moving altogether, forcing the officers to pause, his shoulders squared and his eyes locked on hers. It wasn't the wild panic of someone caught, nor the blank stare of resignation. It was something colder, more deliberate glare that cut through the space between them, as if he could still exert control with nothing but a look. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to carry in the morning air. It was not a shout, not a desperate ply, it was a promise, laced with the same quiet menace she had heard in arguments past, the kind that had once made her shrink back rather than stand her ground. One of the officers tightened their hold on his arm, urging him forward. "Keep moving," they said, but Daniel's gaze stayed locked on her for another heartbeat before he allowed himself to be pulled along. Marissa didn't flinch. She stayed in the doorway, hands resting lightly on the frame, her face unreadable. Inside, she felt the echo of old habits, the instinct to absorb the warning, to let it settle into the back of her mind where his words had lived for years. But this time, the words didn't sink the way they once had. They landed on a surface that had hardened, a part of her that had been rebuilt piece by piece since the day he left. As they reached the patrol car, Daniel twisted slightly as if to get one last look before they lowered his head and guided him inside. His eyes still held that steady burn, but there was something else, now frustration, edging into disbelief. He had never imagined she'd be part of the reason he was standing there in cuffs. The door shut with a heavy thud, and the sound broke. The hold of the moment. The officers climbed into the front, the engine turning over, the soft static of the police radio filling the air. The car began to roll forward, tires crunching against the gravel before hitting the smooth stretch of road. Alvarez lingered near the edge of the yard, watching the vehicle until it disappeared around the corner. Then he turned to her. "He's going to say things. That's all they are, words. Don't give them room to grow." Marissa nodded once, her eyes still fixed on the space where the patrol car had vanished. The glare, the words, they would stay with her for a while, but not as chains. More as a reminder of the final fracture between them, how, even in the moment of his downfall, he had reached for the same weapon he'd always used. When she finally stepped back inside, closing the door behind her, the house felt quieter again. Not the hollow quiet of abandonment, but the steady calm of a place where no one was standing over her shoulder, waiting to see if she would flinch. Outside, the day was just beginning, but for her, something had ended. His glare could follow her in memory, but it couldn't reach her anymore. When the last traces of the patrol car's engine faded down the street, Marissa stood in the doorway. A moment longer, her hand resting on the edge of the frame. The air outside was still cool, touched by the lingering dampness of dawn, but the house behind her felt warmer somehow. She stepped back inside, closing the door gently, not out of caution, but because there was no need for haste anymore. The click of the latch sounded different today, like the end of a sentence. The living room was exactly as she had left it, the blanket draped over the arm of the chair, the empty mug on the coffee table, the faint crease in the cushion where she'd sat through most of the night. But the atmosphere had shifted, the weight that had clung to the air for months heavy with uncertainty. Fear and the sense that at any moment something might shatter had lifted. What remained was a quiet that didn't press in on her, didn't remind her of absence. Simply was she moved slowly through the house, not because she was tired, but because it felt important to notice each step. In the kitchen, the morning light stretched across the counter, glinting faintly on the edge of the drawer where Daniel's confession was still hidden. The letter was there, yes, but it no longer felt like a fragile piece of power she needed. To guard every second, the danger tied to it was now contained, bound in steel and taken away in the back of a car. In the past, after his sudden departures, whether they were business trips or storming out, after an argument this kind of quiet had been sharp. It had made her feel smaller, more alone. The rooms had seemed to grow around her, expanding into spaces she couldn't fill. But this morning, the walls felt close in the way a blanket does, not a cage. The absence was not his. It was the absence of his shadow. She made herself coffee, the ritual steady and familiar. The sound of water filling the kettle, the low hum as it heated. The faint hiss of steam, all of it, layered into the stillness without breaking it. She carried the mug to the kitchen table, the same one where she had sat in the early hours, replaying old wounds in her mind. Now, as she settled into the chair, her thoughts weren't pulled backward. They rested here, in this moment, where the light moved slowly across the floor and the air was calm. It occurred to her that peace was not something loud or obvious. It didn't rush in with grand gestures or sudden clarity. It crept in quietly. In the spaces left open when the noise was gone, she thought of all the noise Daniel had brought into her life, not just in his voice, but in the constant churn of his schemes, his half-truths, his sudden shifts of mood that kept her guessing. Even when he wasn't speaking, his presence had been a hum in the background, impossible to ignore. Now that hum was gone. The quiet was not empty, it was full of the smell of fresh coffee, the soft creak of the house settling, the muted chorus of birds beginning their day outside. She could hear her own breathing, steady and unhurried. She could hear the faint scrape of the mug against the table as she set it down, the sound unaccompanied by tension. She didn't rush to clean or busy herself. She let the moments stretch, unfilled, unclaimed by anyone else's needs. There would be calls to return, questions to answer, maybe even statements to give, but for now there was nothing she needed to do except sit in her own kitchen and exist without being observed, judged, or diminished. The sunlight shifted again, spilling over the edge of the table and onto her hands. She traced the light with her eyes, watching the way it caught on her skin. For the first time in a long time, she realized she wasn't bracing for the next interruption. Whatever came next, it would be on her terms. The quiet stayed, and she let it this time. It wasn't the echo of what had been lost. It was the sound of something she had finally gained. The police station was nothing like the ones on television. There was no constant buzz of shouting officers or the metallic clatter of handcuffs against desks. Instead, it had the muted, orderly hum of a place where long hours passed under fluorescent lights. The walls were painted in a pale color that seemed chosen to offend no one and comfort no one. Marissa stood just inside the lobby, clutching her bag to her side, until an officer behind the front desk gestured for her to follow. Detective Alvarez met her halfway down the hall. He was dressed in the same practical clothes he'd worn to her house, dark slacks, a plain shirt butt here, in his own territory. There was a certain efficiency in his steps, like he was moving along a path he knew by heart. He offered a nod, not quite a smile. "Thanks for coming in. We'll make this quick." She followed him through a narrow corridor lined with closed doors. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. They stopped at a room with a steel door, secured by a keypad and a sliding lock. Alvarez tapped in a code and held the door for her. Inside, the temperature dropped a few degrees. The evidence room was larger than she'd expected, rows of metal shelving running from wall to wall, stacked with boxes, sealed bags, and envelopes of every size. Each item was marked with a white label, the handwriting neat but impersonal. It felt clinical, almost sterile, as if the chaos of the outside world had been broken down into cataloged pieces here. Her eyes followed Alvarez as he led her down one aisle, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the low hum of the air conditioning. Then she saw it. On one of the middle shelves, an entire section was dedicated to boxers bearing a single name in bold black letters: Carter, Daniel. The labels were dated, some going back years. Brown evidence boxers sat beside clear plastic bags filled with papers she couldn't identify from a distance. One shelf held smaller envelopes, each with a case number, and she noticed a laptop sealed inside a transparent case with a property tag. The handwriting on the forms was precise, but the story they told was anything but neat. "These are from multiple warrants," Alvarez explained, seeing where her gaze lingered. "Business records, devices, physical evidence from storage units, even items seized during his arrest." His voice was even professional. But there was an undertone that suggested the sheer scale of what they'd found had surprised even him. Marissa stepped closer to one of the boxes. Through the cutout handle, she could see folders crammed together, their edges worn from handling. A thin strip of paper taped to the lid read, "Financial records, suspect, and spouse." The word spouse made her throat tighten. She wondered how many of those records carried her name without her knowledge, how many times her signature had been forged, or her accounts used as a channel for something she had never agreed to. Handed her a clipboard with the final statements she needed to sign. The pages outlined what she had found, the sequence of events, and the materials she had provided copies of the contracts, the confession letter, and the keys. Each signature felt like drawing a line between herself and the weight of those. Shelves dot, when the paperwork was done, she hesitated before handing the pen back. Her eyes drifted again to the stacks of evidence, and for a brief moment she imagined the noise Daniel would make if he saw it all laid out like this. The denials, the accusations, the insistence that it was all a misunderstanding. Here, the pieces were stripped of his voice, reduced to facts and tags and chain of custody forms. Alvarez closed the clipboard and slid it under his arm. "That's all for now. We'll keep you updated as the case moves forward." And Marissa, his tone softened slightly. "You've done the right thing," she nodded, though the words didn't feel like they needed an answer. As they walked back toward the front, she glanced over her shoulder once more. The aisle of boxes and bags stood unmoving. The story of his downfall, sitting in quiet rows, preserved for the day a courtroom would hear it in full. Outside, the air felt warmer, brighter. She exhaled slowly, the image of his name printed on every label still sharp in her mind. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a recorded truth that could no longer be twisted into something else. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday, tucked among the usual stack of bills and circulars. Marissa noticed it immediately, not of the handwriting, but because of the return address stamped in block letters on the upper left corner, County Detention Center. The sight of it made her pause at the kitchen counter, her fingers resting on the rough paper just long enough to feel the faint indentation of the pen strokes beneath. She thought about tossing it into the drawer with other things she didn't want to deal with, yet loose screws from the cabinet, a dead watch battery, receipts she might need someday. But curiosity, or maybe the need to see it through, kept her from turning away. She slid a knife under the flap and unfolded the pages inside. The letter was written in Daniel's familiar slanted script, the one that always looked hurried, even when he had all the time in the world. There was no greeting, no soft edge to ease her into the words. He started with the same tone he had always used when he wanted to corner her in an argument, direct, biting, certain that the force of his words could override whatever she thought. She knew he accused her of betrayal, of destroying his life to settle some imagined score. He claimed she had exaggerated, twisted, and outright lied to the police. The boxes of evidence, the financial records, the confession, he dismissed them as misunderstandings, planted ideas, or manipulations by people who wanted to see him fall. Every paragraph was an attempt to rewrite the truth into something that placed her at the center of his downfall. There was no apology, not for leaving, not for the things he'd said that morning with his coffee cooling on the counter. not for using her name in her accounts and schemes she hadn't even known existed. Instead, there were lines about how she would regret what she had done, about how people would eventually see her for who she really was. He wrote as though the bars between them were temporary inconveniences, as though this was just another round in a long fight. Marissa read it once, then set it down on the table. The words didn't sting the way they might have before. They didn't land like truth. They landed like noise, familiar in rhythm, but hollow in weight. She poured herself a glass of water and let the letter sit, the paper curling slightly at the edges in the warm air. Later, she read it again, slower this time, searching for something she hadn't noticed before slip. A hint of recognition, even the smallest admission that he knew what he had done. There was nothing. The letter was a mirror held up to the version of himself he still believed in, the one where he was the wronged party and everyone else was an opportunist. She folded it back along the creases, slid it into the envelope, and placed it in a small box in the hall closet. Not because she wanted to keep it close, but because it belonged with the other remnants of him she hadn't yet decided what to do with. The cufflinks left in the bathroom drawer, the duffel bag he hadn't taken that day, the extra house key she found under the planter on the porch. By evening, the letter had faded to the background of her thoughts. She made dinner, washed the dishes, and sat on the couch with a book, the silence of the house undisturbed. She realized that the letter had changed nothing. His voice could still reach her on paper, but it could no longer shape her days. The accusations stayed where they belonged in ink, on a page, shut away in a box that grew heavier in storage, but lighter in her life. The storage unit was on the edge of town, tucked between a row of industrial buildings and a narrow stretch of road, where weeds pushed up through the cracks in the asphalt. Marissa had avoided coming here for weeks, telling herself there was no rush, that the contents could sit untouched a little longer. But now, standing in the early afternoon light with the brass key in her hand, she knew there was nothing left to delay. The metal door rattled when she rolled it up, the sound echoing in the small concrete space. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of cardboard and dust. The boxers were exactly as she'd left them, stacked neatly in rows, some with marker scrawls naming their contents, others blank and impersonal. In the far corner sat the laptop, sealed in its evidence bag. When the police had first cataloged the space, they had already taken what they needed from here, but the rest still remained. The fragments of a life Daniel had built in secret, and the debris of the one they had shared. She started with the smaller boxes. One by one, she opened them, sorting the contents into piles. Old receipts for purchases she'd never seen, bundles of cash folded with rubber bands, binders filled with contracts stamped with names she didn't recognize. In another box, she found personal items, photographs she hadn't known existed, some of whom alone, others with people she'd never met. The expressions in the photos varied. In some, he looked relaxed. In others, calculating, as though he was already halfway to the next move. She worked slowly, taking time to decide what stayed and what went. The police had already taken the evidence tied to the case, but what remained felt like a kind of residue, things that didn't matter to anyone else, but which she no longer wanted to keep. A box of shirts, still smelling faintly of his cologne. A collection of cheap souvenirs from trips she now knew were never about work. A leather-bound planner with weeks of entries written in code-like shorthand. By the time she reached the back wall, her arms were sore from lifting and her palms marked with faint smudges from the cardboard. She paused, leaning against the cool concrete, and looked at the space from where she stood. It was already emptier than it had been when she started, the gaps between the remaining boxes widening, like the last pieces of a puzzle being removed. When the final box was loaded into her car, she stood in the doorway of the unit for a long moment. The concrete floor was bare now, except for a few stray bits of packing tape and dust. The air felt lighter without the weight of those things pressing in from the shelves. She stepped inside, her footsteps sounding louder than before, and let her gaze sweep over the empty walls. It struck her that this was the last physical place where his presence lingered. The house was hers again, his belongings gone. The bank? Accounts had been separated, the legal matters untangled. This was the final tiny, narrow, windowless space where his secrets had been kept. Now stripped of anything that could keep her tethered to them, she rolled the door down slowly, the metal groaning as it slid into place. The sound reverberated. In her chest, final and low, She locked it, pulled the key from the latch, and walked to the rental office. Inside, the clerk barely looked up as she set the brass key on the counter. He took it, marked something on a clipboard, and slid the form toward her to sign. Once she stepped outside, the sunlight felt sharper, the air clearer. She didn't look back at the row of units as she walked to her car. The key was gone. The door was shut. And whatever had been stored in that space object's evidence, the shadow of him was no longer hers to carry. The morning was already warm when Marissa opened the front door, the hinges moving without the faint squeak they used to make. She had oiled them weeks ago on a day when she'd decided that small repairs mattered again. The sunlight poured across the threshold in a clean, unbroken line, spilling onto the wooden floor inside. It was the kind of light that made the dust, motes visible, drifting lazily in the still air, unhurried and without purpose. She stood there for a moment, one hand on the frame, not because she was waiting for anything, but because she wanted to take in the quiet. No one stood on the porch. There was no folded note tucked into the doorframe, no shadow moving at the edge of her vision, no sudden knock breaking the morning. It was only her, the open doorway, and the sound of the neighborhood beginning its day. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and was answered by another farther away. A lawnmower hummed faintly, its tone rising and falling with distance. A few houses over, someone was playing music loud enough for the melody to carry, but not loud enough to intrude. Marissa let these sounds wash over her, each one an ordinary, the marker of life going on without her having to brace for it. She stepped outside onto the porch, the boards warm beneath her bare feet. The railing was clean, the flower pots lined in neat rows with the marigolds she'd planted last month now in full bloom. Their yellow and orange faces turned toward the sun, unapologetic in their brightness. She had chosen them for that reason, for their refusal to be subtle. Her gaze drifted to the street, to the place where the patrol cars had once idled, their lights casting quick flashes against her walls. That morning had been sharp and tense, the air heavy with the expectation of something breaking open. This morning was different. The air was light, open. She could stand here without feeling like she was on display, without wondering who might be watching. After a few minutes, she turned back inside, leaving the door open so the breeze could follow her. The house smelled faintly of coffee and the lavender candle she had lit earlier. On the table sat a small stack of envelopes, ordinary mail. Nothing marked urgent, nothing with official seals. The top one was from a gardening supply store, reminder about the sale on light summer perennials. She smiled at the thought of planting more. She carried her mug to the front room and sat in the chair by the window, the one angled just enough to catch the morning light. The coffee was still hot, and she wrapped both hands around it, feeling the warmth settle into her fingers. From here, she could see the open door, the sunlight cutting across the floor, and the edge of the porch railing where a bird had just landed, tilting its head as if to inspect the space. The thought crossed her mind that this was the first time in a long while she wasn't waiting for news, for trouble, for something to end. The waiting had been a constant, shaping her days into a series of pauses. Now, there was nothing to wait for. The hours ahead were hers to fill, or not, as she chose. She took another sip of coffee, savoring the quiet between the sounds outside. This was not the kind of quiet that pressed in on her. It was the kind that left room to breathe. It was the kind that belonged to a space no longer holding someone else's secrets, no longer shadowed by the weight of their choices. After a while, she rose and walked back to the door. She stood there again, looking out, not to check for anything, but simply to see. The sunlight was still spilling in, unchanged in its brightness. She didn't move to close it right away. The open door felt like an invitation, not a risk. It struck her, as she leaned against the frame, that she had reached a point where her life no longer needed to be defined by what she had been through. This doorway was no longer a place where someone might appear with demands or threats. It was just hers. A view of the street she lived on, the flowers she'd planted, and the day that had only just begun.